And so we're taught that if one person kills another person, that is murder. But if a government kills 100,000 persons, that is patriotism. And they'll say we're disturbing the peace, but there is no peace. What really bothers them is that we are disturbing the war.
I start from the supposition that the world is topsy-turvy, that things are all wrong, that the wrong people are in jail and the wrong people are out of jail, that the wrong people are in power and the wrong people are out of power. I start from the supposition that we don't have to say too much about this because all we have to do is think about the state of the world today and realize that things are all upside down.
History is important. If you don't know history, it's as if you were born yesterday. And if you were born yesterday, anybody up there in a position of power can tell you anything, and you have no way of checking up on it. It's exactly when you're in the midst of a war or about to go into a war that you need your freedom of speech. Lives are at stake. If you are put in fear of speaking out, then democracy has been severely crippled.
When you think of people like Howard, you think of the person who really stands up to authority and understands radicalism in its basic meaning, that is, going to the root of problems and demanding that those problems be confronted.
A life of political engagement is so much more interesting and so much more joyful and comradely than a life of private disengagement and private consumption.
I don't believe it's possible to be neutral. The world is already moving in certain directions. And to be neutral, to be passive in a situation like that is to collaborate with whatever is going on. And I, as a teacher, do not want to be a collaborator with whatever is happening in the world. I want myself as a teacher, and I want you as students to intercede with whatever is happening in the world.
I've always resented the smug statements of politicians, media commentators, corporate executives who talked of how, in America, if you worked hard, you would become rich. The meaning of that was if you were poor, it was because you hadn't worked hard enough. I knew this was a lie about my father and millions of others, men and women who worked harder than anyone. My father had a fourth-grade education and could not read much or do much arithmetic. My mother had gone as far as seventh grade, but her intelligence went far beyond that. She was the brains of the family. We lived in a succession of tenements, sometimes 4 rooms, sometimes 3. Some winters we lived in a building with central heating. Other times we lived in what was called a cold water flat. No heat except from the coal cooking stove in the kitchen. No hot water except what we boiled on that same stove. We 4 boys grew up together, sleeping 2 or 3 to a bed, in rooms dark and uninviting. So I spent a lot of time in the street or the schoolyard, playing handball, football, softball, stickball, or taking boxing lessons from a guy in the neighborhood who had made the golden gloves and was our version of a celebrity.
There was no book in the house. This is not an exaggeration. There was not a single book in the house that I grew up in, but I found books. I found books on the street, and I found later I had discovered the library, you see. In fact, the very first book I read was a book I picked up on the streets. It was just thrown away, you know, first few pages ripped out. Tarzan and the Jewels of Opar. I devoured it, and that led me on, you know, to other things. But my parents knew I loved books, and so when they saw this little ad in the New York Post that if you sent in these coupons with 10 cents, they'd give you a copy of Dickens, a whole set of Dickens. So my parents sent in 10 cents and a coupon, and these books started coming. And I read them all. And Dickens was wonderful. I mean, as I say, sure, I knew about poverty, but I didn't know that the poverty that I experienced was not just in America, it was worldwide. He was talking about the poverty of kids in England. And it made me aware also that there were people like Dickens who were conscious of this and who were writing of it. And I think maybe it suggested to me that I might someday be a writer. Well, I think my interest in the labor movement came sort of naturally, well, one out of the fact that I grew up in a working class family. My father was a waiter. My father was a member of the Waiters Union. And when I went to work in a shipyard at the age of 18, spent 3 years in a shipyard, I became a sort of young organizer, along with several other young people in the shipyard, an organizer of those young people in the shipyard who were not allowed to join the AFL craft unions in the shipyard.
You know, Howard has that great personal warmth, but underneath it, there is this steely anger about the worst aspects of American capitalism and the worst aspects of the American experience, the dark side of the American experience that he never forgets.
There's power in a factory, power in the land, power in the hand of the worker. But it all amounts to nothing if together we don't stand. There is power in a union. Now the lessons of the past will learn the workers' blind.
In my case, there also was sort of a single event which you can sort of point out as important. And I guess that was the event that when I was 17, and these young communists in the neighborhood took me to a demonstration in Times Square. I had never been to a demonstration, but it sounded exciting. You know, young kids will do anything for excitement. I vaguely thought that probably they were demonstrating for something good, like no more war or something. But we got to Times Square, and huge numbers of people milling around, walking through Times Square. And I said to my friends, well, you know, where's the demonstration? And they said, wait, 10 o'clock. Very dramatic. And then when the clock flashed the sign, 10 o'clock, at that moment, suddenly, banners unfurled in the crowds. Figure, oh, there must be a fire somewhere around. And suddenly, I hear sort of screams and pandemonium and people running around out of order, the lines broken up, and I see policemen on horses galloping through the crowd and hitting people. While I'm just taking this in, I am spun around and hit on the side of the head and knocked out. It did suddenly come home to me that, hey, I guess the police are not neutral. I guess the government is not neutral. There's must be some truth to that rhetoric. And yeah, it was a turning point in my political consciousness.
Together we will stand. There is power in a union.
I met Roz while I was working in the shipyard. This was probably about 1941. I had a friend in the Army, and this friend wrote me and said he had a kind of crush on this girl in the neighborhood, and would I please deliver something for him. He's a very shy guy. I dutifully brought his Army insignia over and knocked on her door, and she came to the door, and I gave her the insignia, and then we sort of took a walk around the block. That was it. Nothing like a walk around the block to start things off. And then we actually didn't. We just, we sort of had a few dates, and then I went into the Air Force. And then we wrote to one another while I was in the Air Force. Countless letters. Amazing the way a relationship can develop through correspondence. I could have stayed in the shipyard because I was exempt, considered important work. We were building the USS Iowa, the USS Missouri, building LSTs, landing ship tanks, things that were used in the Normandy invasion. We were building those things. We were important, so I could have stayed, but I was a politically aware young person reading about fascism and the Spanish Civil War and Hitler and Mussolini. And so I wanted to go. I wanted to go fight against fascism, so I volunteered for the Air Force. And to my surprise, I was accepted. When I finished my Air Force training, my aerial gunnery school and bombing school, and I got my lieutenant's bars and my bombardier's wings, and for the first time since I'd been in the Air Force, I came home on an 11-day furlough, and we got together immediately, and 4 days later, we got married in what looked like a sort of shotgun wedding, I was in the Air Force for 2.5 years and dropped bombs on Berlin, dropped bombs on various cities in Germany and Hungary and Czechoslovakia, and even bombed a little town in France towards the very end of the war. And this was a strange one, and one that had a very profound effect on me later as I thought about it. And the war actually in Europe was about over. It was a few weeks from being over, and everybody knew it. But we all awakened in the middle of the night, and they told us we were going to bomb this little town in France because there were several thousand German soldiers around the town. They weren't doing anything, they weren't bothering anyone, they were just waiting for the war to end, but we were going to go over and bomb them. Now, the one odd thing about it, they told us we were not going to carry the usual demolition bombs, 500-pound demolition bombs. We were going to carry instead 30 canisters, 100-pound canisters of jellied gasoline. That's what it was called. Of course, later I learned this was napalm, the first use of napalm in the European theater. And when you're bombing from 30,000 feet, you don't hear anything, you don't see anything, you don't know what's happening to people down there. You don't hear people screaming, you don't see blood, you don't see mangled limbs, none of that. And several thousand people were killed. Germans were killed, French were killed, and it wasn't until really after the war, maybe after I learned about Hiroshima and Nagasaki and began to think about bombing and began to question the total goodness of the good war. Only then did I go think about Royan and that bombing.
It remains to be seen how many people in our time will make that journey from war to nonviolent action against war. It is the great challenge of our time. How to achieve justice with struggle, but without war.
And when I came back and got out of my uniform, and I was back to the working class culture. We were living in a little miserable basement apartment on the edge of Bedford-Stuyvesant, and that's where our daughter Mila was born. But then after a few years, we were able to get into a low-income housing project in Manhattan, Lillienwald Housing Project, and there our son, Jeff, was born. And it was a struggle. We lived in that low-income housing project for 7 years. I was going to graduate school, working a 4 to 12 shift in a warehouse loading trucks. Roz, my wife, was working with some publishing company in Manhattan. But those were, they were the hard times that are typical for young working-class kids who get married early on, have kids early on, and then face the double problem of bringing up kids and at the same time struggling for economic survival.
It's a great pleasure for me to be able to present this 1998 Debs Award in the field of education to Comrade Howard Zinn.
Class conscious, and to me this has always been enormously important. When I started studying, when I went to college for the first time at the age of 27 and began studying history, and I had already myself begun to read the history of labor struggles in this country. And I looked in my textbooks for the stories of these labor struggles, and they weren't there. You know, I looked for the Lawrence Textile Strike of 1912, it wasn't there. I looked for the Colorado Coal Strike of 1913-14, it wasn't there. I looked for the name of Mother Jones, it wasn't there. I looked for Big Bill Haywood, it wasn't there. I was in graduate school. I was way up there, right? I discovered that in graduate school, you get basically the same point of view that you get in elementary school, only with footnotes.
It was early springtime and the strike was on. It drove us miners out of doors, out from the houses that the company owned. We moved into tents up at old Ludlow.
I was interested because I'd been a shipyard worker from the age of 18 to the age of 21 and had joined a union. And one day I heard a song by Woody Guthrie called The Ludlow Massacre, a dark, haunting, powerful song. And that led me to look in a library about this event, which nobody had ever mentioned in any of my history courses, which no textbook of mine had ever mentioned.
I made a run for the children, but a firewall stopped me. 13 children died from your guns. We told the Colorado governor to phone the president, tell him call off his National Guard. But the National Guard belonged to the governor, so he didn't try so very hard. I was worried bad about my children, soldiers guarding.
And the strike was lost. You know, the miners had to go back to work, but the event had a tremendous effect, I think, on lots of people around the country. Anybody who read about the Ludlow Massacre, anybody who heard about it, was bound to be affected by it.
I said, God bless the Mine Workers Union. Then I hung my head and cried.
Did you ever wonder why or how you ended up in all those places just kind of, you know, by accident? You just happened to end up in these times that stuff was just exploding all around you.
A lot of it was accident, yeah. I mean, it was accident that we went down to South and, you know, just at a time, just before the Civil Rights Movement exploded.
In 1956, I was about to get my PhD from Columbia. I'd finished my coursework and I was open for work, especially since I had a wife and 2 kids, and looking for a teaching job, and I'd never heard of Spelman College. I hadn't even thought about black colleges. In fact, I had sort of told the placement bureau that I would teach anywhere except the South. But they said, this is different, you know, you might be interested in black college, etc. So I met with the president in New York, and he hired me to be chair of the History and Social Science Department at Spelman College. When we got there, things were very quiet and very subdued, and you couldn't tell that anything was going to happen in the South. I didn't come down there to lead in a social movement. You know, I came down there to teach and to learn something about the South. And so I wasn't saying to my students, let's go out there and break the barriers of segregation, you know, and you all get arrested. No, I wasn't doing that. But I wasn't a totally passive creature either. That is, when, you might say that through some kind of dialogue between me and my students, we made sort of decisions about, oh, well, here we have a social science club. What do we do for a project? Well, how about tackling racial segregation?
I came to Spelman in '61. The Atlanta movement was really going pretty strong, and I was very excited, and of course joined, demonstrations. And part of what made it possible to do that was that he was with us. He was with the students.
We were in a crisis in the South. We were in a conflict. We needed every bit of energy we could get, and I saw the college campus as a place where there's a huge amount of intellectual energy and human energy, and I didn't want it to be wasted. So from that point on, I began to see the resources of a university, of a college, as something that should not be wasted in merely academic pursuits.
Howard never hesitated to go and take students outside and interracial settings to help challenge, whether it's the public library or the state legislature, the segregated seating or the theater, but he was constantly, again, pushing to say this is not right, and we will challenge that is not right.
We have learned something these past few years about the inadequacy of our regular political structure to bring about desirable social change in a situation of urgency. When people turn in desperation to marches and parades, picketing, sit-ins, mass meetings, and freedom rides, this suggests that the normal channels of government are inadequate for the expression of their grievances, and that the mechanism for solution is rusty.
He really captured the essence of kind of the revolutionary spirit embodied in a professor of history. And that is really quite unique, I think.
His capacity for moral outrage, which is in much deficit today, was again a thing that has throughout fed my spirit, feeds my spirit now. I don't understand how there aren't more people who are just profoundly upset at the racial injustice, at the economic injustice, and having Howard Zinn affirm one's own instincts was an enormously important thing for me as a young black girl growing up in the South at that time, who had a deep yearning to be free and to challenge the status quo. So did he.
And also, of course, in Atlanta, you would never hear any person, black, white, or whatever, expressing the thoughts that he did.
And from then on, things were never the same. They weren't never the same in the city of Atlanta. They were never the same for Spelman College, because Spelman College, which had been such a sedate place, such a controlled place, so conservative, so careful, and now these students were just humming and seething, and their long pent-up indignation at their own lives and their parents' lives, which had been very neatly suppressed in the atmosphere of this college, on the supposition that no, they'd better keep quiet and just learn their lessons and become important people in the black community. That was all over now. And now they were going to be participants in history.
The Southern intellectuals were very supportive of our version of apartheid. I mean, they didn't object to it. Either they kept quiet, either they openly supported it, or they kept quiet.
His activism was not at all loved by anybody, hardly. I mean, maybe one or two teachers.
When the students came back to the campus after being in jail, after protesting, and then rebelled against the restrictions on campus, against the way they were treated, the way they were patronized by the college administration, and I supported them in that internal struggle. That was too much.
He was fired, after all, from Spelman.
This guy is bounced out of Spelman College in the most traumatic imaginable circumstances. The Spelman administration waits until after the students have all left campus. That was the key. And then just axed him.
Certainly the FBI was already putting me on their list. The FBI had taken notice of me in 1962 when I delivered a report on the situation in Albany, Georgia, for the Southern Regional Council, report which made the front page of the New York Times, in which my report criticized the FBI and the Justice Department and the federal government for not defending the constitutional rights of black people. And Martin Luther King, asked about this, said, yes, I was right, that the FBI was really supporting racism in the South. And the FBI took note of my report. And in fact, it was one of the first times they really took note of King as hostile to the FBI. So, you know, did the FBI intercede? Did they do anything? Did they talk to the trustees? I have no way of knowing. This is my favorite place here. It's Dunkin' Donuts, but because it's Harvard, they don't want to call themselves Dunkin' Donuts openly, so they call themselves the Elliott Street Cafe. But if you look closely inside, it's Dunkin' Donuts. It's really funny. But I come here all the time. I meet people here all the time because I love Dunkin' Donuts coffee. I wrote 2 books about the South, actually, and I'd been started to write articles about what was happening in the South around me. You know, living in the black community, what's, you know, the swirl of events, the civil rights movement beginning to develop, and so even before the sit-ins. And I wrote an article for Harper's Magazine, began writing for The Nation. Then Beacon Press, which is a publisher in Boston, asked if I would write a history about the NAACP and the Southern movement. And I wrote back to them and I said, you don't understand. The NAACP is not the heart of the Southern movement. The heart of the Southern movement, SNCC, this unknown group of young people. And so, okay, I wrote a book about SNCC.
SNCC represents the closest thing we have in the United States to that militant mood of change which one finds in emerging nations abroad. It constantly aims to create and recreate, out of the bodies of poor and powerless people, a new force, nonviolent but aggressive, honest and therefore unmanageable. It wants to demonstrate to the nation not what kind of system people should believe in, but how people should live their lives. So its radicalism is not an ideology, but a mood. Moods are harder to define. They are also harder to imprison.
Certainly the writing of the book, The New Abolitionists, set a tone. And I think that might have led us to some degree to have that kind of little intellectual edge about us.
And so what Howard did was lift us onto the pages of history and really made us conscious that we were involved in a struggle that had historical weight.
One of the things that comes through when you look at someone like Howard is you recognize that being a historian or being a journalist doesn't relieve you of your other civic responsibilities. I assume that mainstream historians also go and vote, but somehow we find it a little bit more challenging when we find out they go out and protest also.
I remember in his book when he's talking about the Hattiesburg Freedom Day, and he has a scene in there where he comes into the courtroom. When he gets in there, he finds that some black people have been sitting on the white side, and he's going to sit on the black side.
There was an extremely tense moment when the Hattiesburg chief law officer said, now there's a colored side and a white side, and I want all the colored people to move to that side and the white people to move to the other side. Nobody moves.
And then one of the police officers starts moving towards him, and Howard raises his hand. And the judge asks him if he has something to say. And he says that the Supreme Court has ruled that it's illegal to segregate in any courtroom in the United States. And would you mind following the law of the Supreme Court?
And it was one of those marvelous moments when authority and tradition of a bad kind is challenged, and just because of firmness and willingness to risk what could have been a bloodbath, in the wrong hands, there was at least that moment of change.
Democracy is not just a counting up of votes. It is a counting up of actions. Without those on the bottom acting out their desires for justice, as the government acts out its needs, and those with power and privilege act out theirs, the scales of democracy will be off. That is why civil disobedience is not just to be tolerated. If we are to have a truly democratic society, it is a necessity.
What's interesting to me is that both Stoughton Lynn and Howard Zinn, the only white professors that I remember who joined the civil rights movement and taught in black colleges, were also the first to go with me to North Vietnam.
In Southeast Asia, we want nothing more and nothing less than the assured and guaranteed independence of the peoples of that area. We are in Southeast Asia to help our friends preserve their own opportunity to be free of imported terror, of alien assassination managed by the North Vietnam communists based in Hanoi and backed by the Chinese communists from Peking.
Telling the truth, a truth that the president doesn't want told, can be very powerful. You have the chance, if you know a truth that politicians are trying to conceal, you have the chance just by telling it effectively to save a great many lives, and that's a power that you don't have every day.
Now, this was in the beginning of '68. The Tet Offensive is on in Vietnam, and there's a sudden uprising of rebellion, Viet Cong, a National Liberation Front, all over South Vietnam. And while I'm teaching my seminar, somebody comes in to the seminar and says to me, "I have a telephone call for you." So I told the class to wait, and I went out, and there was Dave Dellinger on the other end of the line, and says, "Well, the North Vietnamese have decided that as a gesture at the time of the Tet holiday in Vietnam, they want to release the first 3 airmen." I said, "Well, okay, when?" "Tomorrow morning." That was it. I packed my bag, and the next morning I was in an apartment in Greenwich Village, meeting Dave Dellinger, Tom Hayden, and for the first time, Dan Berrigan. And we hopped on a plane that day and flew halfway around the world.
What indications from North Vietnam have you had that you'll be able to pick these men up?
Well, the sole thing that I'm aware of was a telegram sent from Hanoi and arriving, I believe, when was it, Sunday?
And it was addressed to Dave Dellinger, the American Peace Movement, and it said that the North Vietnamese were prepared to release 3 American airmen if the peace movement would send a representative to Hanoi.
So you expect to get the men or have the men released to your custody in Hanoi, not here?
That's what we expect, yeah.
It was, the other side of the moon for both of us. The Tet uprising had occurred in South Vietnam, in Saigon, and everything was frozen, including ourselves.
Remember, they even got into the embassy, they took over the American embassy in Saigon. It was a very frightening thing for the American establishment and the American public. And so Dan Berrigan and I spent a week in Vientiane before the plane finally was able to get out of Saigon, come to Vientiane in Laos and take us on a strange trip through the night to Hanoi.
We were in night shelters, bomb shelters in the hotel practically every night. We toured the shelters of the city. Practically all children had been evacuated.
Well, we saw Hanoi under siege and war, and we experienced bombings every day in Hanoi. And this is my first time on the receiving end. It was a sobering experience to feel what it was like being bombed rather than bombing.
Then one day, suddenly, all these things happened suddenly. We were brought unexpectedly into a big hall, into this blinding light, into this international forest of cameras and of news people, and they paraded the 3 airmen into the room, still in their prison uniform. We had an agreement with the White House that they would be in our custody back to New York, and that would be honored. We landed in Vientiane. Aboard came this unspeakable character, Robert Sullivan, ambassador to Laos.
They will fly in the air attache's aircraft to Udon, remain overnight there, and return by most expeditious means to the United States. The representatives of the embassy here in Vientiane, while talking about free choice for the pilots, made it clear that the United States preferred that they go back by military plane.
Major, you were in the plane there for about 45 minutes. What was the discussion all about?
I'm not at liberty to discuss that. Not only did the North Vietnamese make it clear to us that this question of the pilots going home by a non-military plane was important, but they made it clear to the pilots. And I recall that when we suggested that the people in Washington making this decision had not been to North Vietnam recently or not recently, they had not talked with the North Vietnamese, and that perhaps we and the pilots knew something about the North Vietnamese attitude which they did not know. Whereupon the ambassador came back with, I thought, a marvelous answer. He said that one of the persons in Washington making this decision was a man who had survived a Japanese prison camp and had come out of it weighing 97 pounds, period. At which point Father Berrigan said, "These men don't weigh 97 pounds. I don't see the analogy." In fact, Father Berrigan and I, on our way back, this may seem presumptuous on our part, but on our way back from Paris, we sent a wire, I think with our last $15, to the White House, saying something like, "We'd like to talk to you, President Johnson. Would you please meet with us? We just come back from Hanoi. We've just talked with the Premier Pham Van Dong. We just read in the newspaper that you say the North Vietnamese are not ready to negotiate. What we learned from Pham Van Dong seems to contradict that. We'd like to talk with you about this and about the prisoner release, which we think has been mishandled, but we have not so far received an answer from LBJ. At this day. Yeah.
I know many people have said, look, we've killed innocent people. Our bombs have killed civilians and babies and mothers. And I suppose there is truth to that. There have been people that have been killed. But your government has not bombed civilians. Your government has not bombed open cities. Your government has sent its bombers in after targets, military targets, that have been placed in an area surrounded by civilians.
I was in North Vietnam during the war, and I saw the effects of these cluster bombs on little kids, and little round bombs that contain hundreds and hundreds of steel pellets. And when the bomb explodes, these pellets shoot out, and they enter the bodies of people, and almost all civilians, just farmers and their families, and then they're very, very hard surgically to get out.
One of the strangest things that happened was we were very interested in knowing how the Vietnamese withstood this bombing. And so far to the north of Hanoi, they took us to a mountain that had caves in it where they had fought against the Chinese and the Japanese and the French before the Americans. And it was like an underground world, kind of the kind of thing that you would see in a Star Wars movie now. And so we had a dinner and a meeting in this cave. It was the size of a basketball auditorium. And then the thing that the Vietnamese always do is they all get up and sing songs about their struggle or traditional songs of the country, and then whether you can sing or not, they ask you to stand up and sing. So Howard sang America the Beautiful.
domino theory is one of those great pieces of nonsense which the administration keeps uttering, and which any student of international affairs, I think, can demolish in a very short time. How did Vietnam fall? If Vietnam is about to fall, did it fall because of something that came from abroad? It fell because of internal conditions, or it's falling because of internal conditions in Vietnam. The best way to make sure that a country turns to communism is to put foreign military forces in it, because then the communists will have a nationalist cause which they can use against the foreign power.
And when his book came out, I think 1966 or so, there wasn't a, it was so inconsistent with the drift of thinking and understanding that most people couldn't even read it. They couldn't read the words.
Vietnam, it seems, has become a theater of the absurd. Early in 1966, a new pacification technique was developed by American soldiers. It involved surrounding a village, killing as many young men as could be found, and then taking away the women and children by helicopter. The Americans called this procedure Operation County Fair.
I was very conscious of the role of the historian and how a historian who didn't use her knowledge to play some role in what was the most serious issue before the nation was somebody who was neglecting his or her duty to education, to students.
My first encounter with Howard was literally my first day as a freshman at BU. I arrived there, and almost immediately hundreds of students, swarmed into the Marsh Chapel and provided a sanctuary for a soldier who had gone AWOL from a military base near Boston. He'd been given orders to ship out to Vietnam. He came to BU and, was immediately supported by people there. It was a 24-hour day, teach-in, really. It was music, people bringing in food, people speaking around the clock. And Howard probably spoke a half a dozen times during that week, and it was very inspiring to me. I mean, he was spellbinding and making connections between the war and civil disobedience, the history of war during the 20th century, his own experience as a bombing pilot in World War II. And I'd never seen anything like it before.
Students were expected to be quiet and live in the dormitory and be supported by mom and dad and take classes and do as they're told. Then along came the 60s and people like Zinn and the students of my generation. And all of a sudden we were getting involved in issues right there on the campus that had been considered outside of our purview completely.
That's what they mean when they say the 60s ruined education. That is, there was this incredible life that suddenly came into the universities as the world entered the university and the university entered the world.
Eventually, Boston University did become a hot point of student protest against the war. And the hotter it got, the more we depended on Howard Zinn to support us, because while other faculty members thought that sometimes we'd gone too far, Zinn was always right there, indeed, backing us up and giving us the intellectual justification for our points of view.
So now this guy is trying to get tenure at Boston University. And looks like, I think he didn't get it one time, and this is a second time around. All it needs is the vote of the trustees. So the students come to him and ask him to speak against the war, and he doesn't really connect the two things. He said, well, sure, because if you were in Howard's position, or you always said sure. And then it gets a little closer, and you say, well, where is this going to be? And they say, well, right outside the such and such hotel, because we're trying to speak to the trustees. And it begins to dawn on her, now wait a minute. These are the same trustees that on that same day are going to be voting on my tenure. And then he says, and who else will be speaking? Oh, you're the only one. And he says, yes, I'll speak. And by the time he speaks, the trustees have voted. Who knows what would have happened had the chronology been otherwise, but that's how it came down.
Nonviolence does not mean acceptance, but resistance. Not waiting, but acting. It is not at all passive. It involves strikes, boycotts, non-cooperation, mass demonstrations, and sabotage, as well as appeals to the conscience of the world, even to individuals in the oppressing group who might break away from their past. Direct action does not deride using the political rights, the civil liberties, even the voting mechanisms in those societies where they are available, but it recognizes the limitations of those controlled rights and goes beyond.
The law is not a holy thing. I remember when Dan Berrigan broke the law and they interviewed his 80-year-old mother and they said, oh, what do you think about your son? What do you think about him breaking the law? I guess they thought an 80-year-old woman would have 80 years of respect for the law behind her and she'd give them the right answer. And Dan Berrigan's mother said, it's not God's law. And she had it there. The law is made by very mortal people. Very limited people, very opinionated people, and people who have very special interests. They make the law, they tell us what the law is, and then they act as if it's holy writ.
A lot of people are troubled by civil disobedience. As soon as you talk about committing civil disobedience, they get a little upset. That's exactly the purpose of civil disobedience. To upset people, to trouble them, to disturb them. We who commit civil disobedience are disturbed too, and we mean to disturb those who are in charge of the war.
He said at the end of his speech, I remember, he said, now let me address the secret police in this crowd.
You agents of the FBI who are circulating in the crowd. Hey, don't you see that you're violating the spirit of democracy by what you're doing? Don't you see that you're behaving like the secret police of a totalitarian state?
Well, that cost him a bit, I think, the next day when we were sitting in front of the Federal Building, I have a feeling. Because, again, the police chose in the end to arrest almost no one. They didn't want arrest, they didn't want a trial, they didn't want the publicity that would be associated with that. They only arrested a couple of ringleaders, and one of those was Howard.
And so, let the spirit of disobedience spread to the war factories, to the battlefields, to the halls of Congress, every town and city, until the killing stops, until we can hold up our heads again before the world. Because our children deserve a world without war, and we ought to try to give them that.
And at that point, the batons were raised and they began clubbing us very heavily. Howard was pulled up, as I say, his shirt was ripped apart, he was taken away, and I saw blood coming down his chest as he left.
Let us be nonviolent. We are going to be protesting against violence. We may break some petty laws. We may interfere slightly with business as usual, but these are not terrible crimes. There are terrible crimes being committed, and sitting down and locking arms, that's no terrible crime. War is the great crime of our age.
Most people don't confront the challenge to go to jail, but they often confront a challenge to do the right thing or to say the truth at the risk of their jobs. And they usually don't choose, I would say, to risk their careers very much, partly because they don't have examples of that. They don't. The courage of that sort is contagious, and they may or may not have the luck to meet somebody who is exhibiting that kind of courage.
Boston University was this great center of anti-war activity, and then in 1971, John Silber arrives. He takes a different view of the university. He takes a different view of protests against the war in Vietnam. He's sort of a university president, but also a policeman.
It took exceptional conditions for the faculty at BU to decide to form a union. And those exceptional conditions, I think, were the goading, the aggravation, the outlandish provocations of the Silber administration.
I did know people who were in the BU administration who felt that Howard, their side of it was that Howard was disloyal, that he refused to cross the picket line when the clerical workers were on strike. And Howard said, "You're damn right I did, because I had solidarity with these people, and I wasn't going to cross their picket line. And I would teach my classes that maybe outside of the school." But that's the kind of thing that President Silber wouldn't accept.
I went to Boston University 72 to 76, arrived there in 72, the year after John Silber got there. He did not know what to do with you, because he was trying to create this powerful Harvard on the other side of the river, and there you were, but you were the most popular professor on campus, and I just wanted to know how it ended up.
Well, see, he was limited. He had no nuclear weapons. If he could have acquired them, he would have. This is a guy, who, we're not just talking about campus politics, right? He's a guy who believed in, sending arms to El Salvador, to the death squad government of El Salvador, and refused to give an honorary degree to Mandela, and he was. I could go on, but what happened with us? It was a standoff. He had his office and his money and his buildings and his trees, and I had these 400 students every semester. And so, it would drive him crazy, because he would not allow me to have any teaching assistants, you see. And he sent a letter. The department head, actually, the very decent person, showed me the letter we got. The letter said, "If Zinn will cut his class down to 80 students, I will give him teaching assistants." In 1979, we went on strike at Boston University. The professors went on strike, the secretaries went on strike, the librarians went on strike, the buildings and grounds workers went on strike. We had almost an IWW general strike at Boston University, and we won.
Welcome to our home.
Thank you.
Welcome, welcome. We're all waiting for you. We just had some announcements, and the students have tons of questions to ask you.
All right, I won't speak long. What do you think they're most interested in?
You can actually ask them. Our students are pretty open about saying what they think and what they want to know.
Okay.
So, come on right up.
When I started to write my book, my heroes were not going to be military heroes. My heroes were going to be people who fought against war, spoke out, protested against war.
Thus, in that inevitable taking of sides which comes from the selection of history, I prefer to tell the story of the discovery of America from the viewpoint of the Arawaks, of the Constitution of America from the viewpoint of the slaves, of Andrew Jackson as seen by the Cherokees, of the rise of industrialism as seen by the young women in the Lowell textile mills, of the Spanish-American War as seen by the Cubans, the conquest of the Philippines as seen by the black soldiers on Luzon, the First World War as seen from the eyes of socialists, the New Deal as seen by blacks in Harlem, and so on, to the limited extent that any one person, however he or she strains, can see history from the standpoint of others.
Any other questions about anything?
What was the reception of you when People's History came out? How did the historian public treat you?
There's a lot of looking with suspicion upon somebody like me because I'm not writing for them. I'm not. For instance, my book was never reviewed in the main journal of the historians, the American Historical Review. It was reviewed in the New York Times. It was reviewed in newspapers all over the country. It was reviewed in magazines, but it was not reviewed in the professional historical journal. So there was a historian, a famous historian at Harvard, and he hated my book. Why? He said that I paid too much attention to the Indians. Really? He just probably read the first 3 pages of my book. I don't know. No, he must have done more because he didn't like what I said about Vietnam. He didn't like what I said about Nixon. He was for the war in Vietnam. He was a supporter of Nixon. And so he trashed my book. On the other hand, the reviewer in the New York Times, Eric Foner, teaches at Columbia University, he liked my book because he's a progressive historian. He has a point of view closer to mine. So whether historians liked or disliked my book depended really on their point of view.
Plus, I thought it was intriguing that a Caucasian would tell all kinds of history of all people, like black history and Chinese people and immigrants, and that's something our school books lack.
My name's Luke. We drove up from Atlanta to see Howard Zinn. We just drove up yesterday. It's about a 12-hour drive.
He said everything that was in my head, basically. Like everything I believed he was agreeing with, and he was expanding on it too.
I want to teach the truth to my students someday, so that's why I'm here.
Do you like folk music? Oh. It has the St. Patrick Battalion song.
Can I have this?
Yeah.
Great. Thank you, Dave. Yeah, I appreciate that. I wanted, in writing this book, to awaken a consciousness in my readers of class conflict, of racial injustice, of sexual inequality, and of national arrogance. And I also wanted to bring into light the hidden resistance of the people against the power of the establishment. I thought that to omit these acts of resistance, to omit these victories, however limited, by the people of the United States, was to create the idea that power rests only with those who have the guns, who possess the wealth. I wanted to point out that people who seem to have no power, working people, people of color, women, once they organize and protest and create national movements, they have a power that no government can suppress. I don't want to invent victories for people's movements, but to think that history writing must simply recapitulate the failures that dominate the past is to make historians collaborators in an endless cycle of defeat. And if history is to be creative, if it's to anticipate a possible future without denying the past, it should, I think, emphasize new possibilities by disclosing those hidden episodes of the past when, even if in brief flashes, people showed their ability to resist, to join together, occasionally to win. I'm supposing, or perhaps only hoping, that our future may be found in the past's fugitive moments of compassion rather than in the solid centuries of warfare.
peut-être ça va inspirer des historiens français de faire la même chose pour une fois et désacraliser tous les grands chefs d'État français. Donc peut-être qu'on comprendra mieux ça et on peut-être aussi avec la perspective et le recul, on comprendra que l'histoire de la France ressemble assez à celle des États-Unis avec cette conquête de colonisation. Voilà.
You did heroic work.
I think that I wrote a people's history because I was looking for such a history and it didn't exist. I was not at all sure I would go through it. It was a very daunting task, and several times I started to give up on it, and my wife Roz said, "No, you must do this. You must keep at it." And probably without her insistence, I might have dropped the idea, because the idea of writing a book which takes in all of American history and try to put it into one volume, well, yeah, it was a big job. Roz is actually my first editor. She's the only person I show my work to before it goes to the publisher, because she's a reader. She's not particularly a reader of history. She's a reader of novels, and she knows what good writing is, and so also she can look at history from the standpoint of somebody who is not a professional historian and who can say, this doesn't make any sense, or this isn't clear, or you're going too far.
Anyone reading history should understand from the start that there is no such thing as impartial history. The chief problem in historical honesty is not outright lying. It is omission or de-emphasis of important data. The definition of important, of course, depends on one's values. We are not starting from scratch. There is a long history in this country of rebellion against the establishment, of resistance to orthodoxy. There has always been a common sense perception that there are things seriously wrong and that we can't really depend on those in charge to set them right.
I always was interested in theater, but too busy with teaching and writing about history and movements and so on to venture into the theater until when the war in Vietnam ended in 1975, I felt I had a moment to breathe. I no longer had to run around the country making speeches about the war. And so I sat down and wrote a play about Emma Goldman, who had become one of my heroes, an anarchist, feminist, outrageous woman. And then more recently I did Marx in Soho, a one-person play in which Karl Marx returns to the present.
Well, when I wrote my play, Emma, and for the first time I was in the theater, and suddenly I found I wasn't alone. It's a very intense experience, rehearsing every day, every night, being with the same people over and over again. And it's very, very different than writing a book, writing anything where you're on your own.
Right.
Yeah, you're an isolated individual.
Giant merger between Chase Manhattan Bank and Chemical Bank. 10,000 workers to lose jobs. Stocks rise. And they say my ideas are dead.
From 1960, the Civil Rights Movement, to 1999, the WTO, Howard has managed to make himself useful, of service to one generation of rebels after another. And it's very, very difficult to have that kind of perseverance.
Remember, to be radical is simply to grasp the root of a problem. And the root is us. I have a suggestion. Pretend you have boils. Pretend sitting on your ass gives you enormous pain. So you must get up, you must move, you must act. Let's not talk anymore of capitalism, socialism. Let's just talk of using the incredible wealth of the earth for human beings. Give people what they need. Food, water, clean air, pleasant homes to live in, trees, some grass, some hours of work, more hours of leisure. Don't ask who deserves it. Every human being deserves it.
When he tells people about the truth of American history and not the myth, and he really is clear, the young people have an enormous sense of relief.
Do you think there'll be students tonight who are not anti-war, who have just come out of curiosity?
Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Absolutely, absolutely.
Those are the ones we want. War doesn't solve fundamental things. It's like crack. Really. War is like a fix. You get high on war. We won. And then you're down on the ground again, and you need another fix. You need another war. Why do you think we've had war after war after war after war? During every war they say this is the end. This is the last war. In World War I, they said this is the war to end all wars. And then not long after that was World War II. And then soon the United States was waging war in Korea, and then in Vietnam, then in Grenada. Imagine making war on Grenada, What a great victory that was for the United States to defeat Grenada. If you study history, what you learn is that wars are always accompanied by lies. Wars are always accompanied by deceptions. Wars are always accompanied by, we're going to war to fight for democracy. We're going to war to fight for freedom. Behind all the lies and deceptions that accompanied all these wars, was one basic motive that is behind all of these wars. Expansion, power, economics, business, really. The VA, 10 years after the Gulf War, reported that 8,000 veterans of the Gulf War were dead for various reasons. That of the 600,000 soldiers who fought in the Gulf War, 200,000 of them after the Gulf War filed claims with the Veterans Administration for disabilities that they had suffered during the war as a result of the weaponry that the United States was using in the war. The weapons that we use against other people are also used against us. A government that is ruthless about what it does to other people is also ruthless in what it does to our own people.
We're at war, they said, and I thought, they have learned nothing, absolutely nothing, from the history of the 20th century, from 100 years of retaliation, vengeance, war, 100 years of terrorism and counterterrorism, of violence met with violence, in an unending cycle of stupidity. Our security can only come by using our national wealth, not for guns, planes, bombs, but for the health and welfare of our people, for free medical care for everyone, education and housing guaranteed, decent wages, and a clean environment for all. We cannot be secure by limiting our liberties, as some of our political leaders are demanding, but only by expanding them. We should take our example not from our military and political leaders shouting retaliate and war, but from the doctors and nurses and medical students and firemen and policemen who have been saving lives in the midst of mayhem, whose first thoughts are not violence, but healing, not vengeance, but compassion.
It's exactly when you're in the midst of a war or about to go into a war that you need your freedom of speech. You need the most sharp and honest discussion of what is going on because lives are at stake. War is a matter of life and death. That's when you need to make sure you're doing the right thing in national policy. And if at that moment, because of war, your free speech is hampered, if you are put in fear of speaking out, then democracy has been severely crippled. That's what's happening today.
In 1999, ABC asked Dr. Zinn what was on his mind at the close of the century. He answered in part, "What I'm thinking about is the need to have the next century not filled with war. The people of all nations in the world are getting tired, I think, of the national rhetoric driving people to war." Well, let me not speak the man's words for him. Let me give him to you, Dr. Howard Zinn.
I haven't seen a crowd like this, really, for a very long time, and it's really heartening to be here. This is democracy, and democracy is not there. Democracy is not in the White House. We can't find democracy in Congress or the Supreme Court. This is where democracy is, places like this all over the country. When you go to war against a tyrant, you are killing the victims of the tyrants. You know, the deaths of all these people will be explained in the way the deaths of people have always been explained, with lies and deceit. We have another accident, and it's collateral damage. That's the language of terrorism. You know? But people are going to be hurt, and then, you know, will Iraq be, after all of that, will Iraq be a democracy? The real question is, will the United States be a democracy? And so if we go to war, you know, we may not lose many Americans. All that we'll lose will be the soul of America. You know, we live in a beautiful country that's been taken over by men who have faith in guns and bombs, and I think we will need to take our country back. Thank you.
Dr. Howard Zinn!
I suppose what it suggests to us is that we have a big job to do, a very big job to do. These things, the good things that have been done, the reforms that have been made, the wars that have been stopped, the women's rights that have been won, the racism that has been partly extirpated in society, all of that was not done by government edict. It was not done by the three branches of government. It was not done by that structure which we learn about in junior high school, which they say is democracy. It was all done by citizens' movements. And keep in mind that great movements in the past have arisen from small movements, from tiny clusters of people that have gotten together here and there. If you have a movement strong enough, it doesn't matter who's in the White House. What really matters is what are people doing, and what are people saying, and what are people demanding, you see.
To be hopeful in bad times is not just foolishly romantic. It is based on the fact that human history is a history not only of cruelty, but also of compassion, sacrifice, courage, kindness. And if we do act, in however small a way, we don't have to wait for some grand utopian future. The future is an infinite succession of presents, and to live now as we think human beings should live, in defiance of all that is bad around us, is itself a marvelous victory.
So Rumsfeld is explaining the threats to the West and why they are invisible and unidentifiable. And he says, I'm quoting him now, because I could not make this up.
There are things that we know, and there are known unknowns. That is to say, there are things we now know that we don't know. But there are also unknown unknowns. These are things we do not know we do not know. He goes on to say, simply because you do not have evidence that something exists doesn't mean that you have evidence that it doesn't exist.
Life is in motion. I'm stuck in line. Oh, rise. You can't be neutral on a moving train. One day the symptoms fade. Think of the road.
I don't know if you have the same feeling I do. You wake up in the morning, you read the paper, and you feel that you are in an occupied country. You see, that you feel some alien group has taken over our country. But those men in the White House who are making these decisions to send young people to kill and be killed, those people are alien to me. The secret is people. The secret is people getting together. The secret is telling the truth. The truth is powerful, and it can only be suppressed for so long. And the truth gets out, and when the truth gets out, a power is created that is greater than the power of the guns and money that a government possesses. You see. Remember when Ali fought Foreman? He seemed asleep, but when he woke up, he was ferocious. So will the people wake up.